Hello, I'm George Liston, CA. Welcome to Dialogue, a program that explores the world of ideas and issues in international affairs, history, and culture. When he recounted the glories of Athens, Thucydides was also candid about her blemishes. Of poverty, he said this: "We think it no disgrace to acknowledge poverty, but a real degradation to make no effort to overcome it." To apply his wisdom to our 21st century world means making a serious commitment to overcoming global poverty, first appreciating its magnitude, and then fully employing an arsenal of weapons against it. The place of trade in that arsenal is a subject of growing interest and debate, and one which we will address today. My guests are John Sewell, a senior scholar at the Woodrow Wilson Center and former president of the Overseas Development Council, and Alan Winters, director of the World Bank's Development Research Group and a professor of economics at the University of Sussex. Gentlemen, welcome to Dialogue.
Thanks, George.
It's a delight to have you here on an extremely important topic to talk about. John, let's start with you, just to get an understanding of what we're talking about, particularly in terms of poverty itself. Let me introduce right off the bat the term absolute poverty. Get from you a sense of how we define it and just how much of the world is afflicted by it.
Well, George, absolute poverty is the title of the statistic about how many people try and live on an income of under $1 a day. There's two measures of poverty: $1 a day income, $2 a day income. There are well over 1 billion people trying to live on an income of under $1 a day, and close to 3 billion people living under the $2 a day level. And this is the face of poverty in the world at the beginning of the 20th century. In some ways, things have changed for the better.
Right.
The percentage of people living in poverty of the world's population has gone down, but the number of people stays the same due to population growth, and in some countries has gone up
Right.
In this period of time.
Well, John, you know, those numbers stagger me because I think you could aggregate them. You took the 1 million and 2 million together, that's obviously 3 billion people. That seems to me that's half the world's population.
It's a little bit under half the world's population.
Right, but not much under.
Not much. And if that continues, when population growth probably stabilizes in the middle of this century, there'll still be well over 4 billion people living in poverty, and that's a pretty uncomfortable world to be in.
Absolutely, John, and mid-century, it has a poetic sound, but it's not very far off.
No, it's not very far off. Most people's of my age grandchildren will be well alive, and probably their children if they behave themselves at the time we reach 2050. So therefore you're talking about the world in which people we all know will still be living.
Well, that's frightening enough, right? To tell you the truth. Against that, John, are we thinking about it the right way? For example, when we talk about poverty, I think there's an inclination among even the most considerate of us to think of it as, quote, a soft issue, a kind of something it'd be nice to do things about. But with figures like that, should we be thinking in a harder sense of it as a priority, an urgent issue?
Well, you know, I consider ending poverty the preeminent ethical issue of our time, just as ending slavery was in the 18th and 19th century. But there is an issue of realpolitik, particularly for the United States, whether one looks at trade or environmental degradation or conflict in the developing countries. There is a considerable set of national interests, which, due to the globalization of communications, will end up on our shore much faster. After all, if I'm suffering from avian flu and get on a plane in Turkey, I can be in the United States in less than 12 hours. And I may be carrying it and nobody knows it. So these connections are very important for the United States, and ending poverty has a direct relationship to these.
Health issues know no boundaries, do they? Nor do issues of terrorism when you get down to it. And I would think that would be another, not that the poor are terrorists, but that those conditions certainly breed discontent. Well,
terrorism is not caused by poverty. I mean, if you take Osama bin Laden, he's a very well-educated person, so are the major planners in Al-Qaeda. But it does provide the sea in which terrorists move. And when people have no hope, they turn to extremists. The extremists can be terrorists, they can be demagogic leaders, but people who have no hope seek any way out of their circumstances, which are hard for most Americans to understand.
Right. I want to turn to Alan and get a sense of how economics, and particularly trade, can help address this problem. But before I do that, one last brief question to you, John. Has the I'm in my mind, I have this phrase, Millennium Development Goals, as a product, I think, of the United Nations. What are those goals for this problem? Has a target been set?
Yes, there's a target been set, internationally agreed upon target. President Bush reinforced the U.S. endorsement of them last year. There are 8 goals that are to be met by the year 2015. They include cutting in half the number of people living in absolute poverty. They're doable in some cases, but they're not doable in every country in that time frame. But they are doable. We know how to cut infant mortality. You know how to cut the birth rate. We probably know how to slash the increasing incidence of HIV/AIDS if we're willing to do it. And they provide a useful, realistic set of markers for measuring progress, right, which should be used as a major policy tool.
And that the goal is reduction of half?
Cut absolute poverty in half by 2015.
By 2015.
Actually, that one will be reached. Because it will be reached in India and China, which are growing very fast and paying attention to poverty.
Right.
But that's the statistical argument, which doesn't have much meaning, because lots of countries will still have a large number of poor people.
True, but that also suggests a variety of countries and poverty, their situations, which makes it, for me, all the more happy to have Alan here to explain how these various factors are affected by economics and by trade. I guess that's the very first question for you, Alan. How does the mechanism of trade, how can it work, be made to work to alleviate poverty? What's the connection?
Well, let's start back with absolute poverty. The absolute poor in the world, very, very many of them are subsistence farmers. They have a small plot of land, often in rather hostile conditions, and they grow next to nothing by our standards, but just enough to stay alive. How do you help those people get a bit richer? Throughout the centuries, we've learned that what they actually need to do is find something to sell to somebody else.
Right.
To produce something that is more than they need themselves, so that they can sell it to somebody else and buy stuff in. And in a sense, that is the way all of economics starts to address poverty, by allowing people to concentrate and focus on what they can do and sell the surplus to other people who are doing something else. International trade, in the sense you've used the word trade, just broadens that set of horizons. The whole point about producing stuff to sell to people is that people are different. Ideally, you want to find people who really can't do the things that you can do,
right,
because then there's the most benefit from the trade. And so by spreading the net not only to the next village or the next town or the next city, but to the next country or the country on the other side of the world, in a sense you broaden the horizon of differences over which you can trade, and hence over which you can generate income.
So that the basic goal then is to create more wealth, actually, greater levels of income through these patterns of trade in which everyone has a certain perceived advantage. Is that correct?
Yes, that's exactly right. All advance beyond just over the subsistence level really depends on acquiring things from other people, sometimes by force, the old monarchs and so on, but mostly through commerce, selling all sorts of things. It may be beans, it may be time on television, but you're selling something.
But given that increased economic growth, which I think is what you're saying is the product of these beneficial trade patterns, is the question then how it's distributed internally? Is that sort of the next key phase? I mean, to really make sure it does get to those who are least advantaged in these countries.
I think that's the key. There are distributional issues between countries. Conditions change in the world so that sometimes some countries are well placed and in other times other countries are well placed. But within a country, there are also really serious issues of distributing the gains from trade. And I think the way to think about it is the following. Opening up international trade doesn't guarantee everybody a sale.
Right.
It opens up opportunities for those people who are willing, or in particular able, to take advantage of them. So often the very poor are also at the very bottom of the pecking order in terms of ability to exploit the opportunities that we create. And that's where we need sort of conscious policy typically to try and help them reach and bring some of the benefits down to them.
I'm very glad to hear you say that, Ellen, because it struck me that, and it's an extremely helpful answer that you've given me, but the people we're talking about, John's definition of the absolute poor are, by definition, the least trained, and therefore those who can't automatically participate even in growing economies unless they get special help, right? or more than...
A tendency in that direction, but it's not the case that there's absolutely nothing for untrained people to do. The first stages, for instance, of agriculture would be growing crops on small holdings, tending livestock, and you can typically sell those products in the local markets. Providing that local market has got some connection with the wider world, you start to see the ripples of opportunity filtering down to fairly low levels.
Right.
So, for instance, we still consume goods in America or in Europe which are grown on smallholder farms. Coffee, a lot of coffee, for instance, grown by smallholders who are very poor, but would be very, very poor if they couldn't sell us the coffee.
Right. Alan, what do the studies tell us at this point about liberalization of trade and its effect on the poor among different sets of countries?
I think the studies are fairly clear. There is dispute among economists. We earn our livings by disputing, so you shouldn't be too surprised. But I think the general tenor of the evidence is that, on average, international trade is associated with quite significant opportunities for economic growth. There are circumstances where liberalizing international trade, opening up, doesn't generate the growth because some other part of the cocktail isn't there.
Right.
And as we've commented, it's not the case that everybody in a country rises at the same rate. Indeed, you'll typically find some people better able to take advantage than others.
Is time a factor? Is there a kind of a short-term, long-term differentiation in who benefits when and to how much?
Oh, certainly time is an important factor. Essentially, to take advantage of the opening up of a market, internally or externally, you need to adjust. You need to see the opportunity. You then need to start doing the activity, producing the good, the service for which there is a market. Sometimes that's very quick. You just switch from one crop to another. But very often you might have to learn how to produce that crop. You might have to generate special marketing facilities. And then as you go further, you might have to, if we're talking about producing manufactures, wait for factories to be built, wait for roads to take the goods to the port. So time is a great healer in this. Essentially, people try not to stick around in areas that generate very, very low incomes. They might move themselves or they change their activities, and time is part of that process.
So their mobility is also a big influence on how well they can take advantage of these changed circumstances.
Both mobility and, in a sense, learning or changing on the spot.
I've learned an immense amount from both of you gentlemen so far. And let me try to put both of your insights together in this next question. I've gotten the sense from both you, John, and you, Alan, that the poor are themselves, as I said, a very variegated lot. The countries that have poverty are not all alike. They're very different. I mean, we can isolate China, Brazil, Indonesia, sets of countries that are in very different circumstances. I think we might agree that of all the areas of this world where poverty is an extraordinary major problem, that's practically all the areas of the world when you get down to it, Africa might be the most acute. And so the question I guess I pose for both of you, and you first, Alan, and then you, John, is it a special case? Is it something that's going to require, we're talking about the benefits of trade, but is Africa's situation so desperate, sub-Saharan Africa, that trade alone is not going to be it? We're going to have to think about that differently.
Oh, absolutely. Trade alone is almost never the answer. You exactly need the other conditions that encourage people to take advantage of opportunities. Some of those, as I said, are physical infrastructure. No point growing beans if you can't get them to market. But also there are conditions of some assurance that if you invest in your own time, your own money, you will reap some benefit from this. If you live in a kleptocratic regime where anything successful actually ends up in the pocket of the president's nephew, then indeed you won't bother and the whole thing won't take off.
Right.
So trade is certainly not sufficient for Africa. Now, we can ask, is it necessary? And I incline to the view that to have sustained growth in Africa, we will need to see fairly open trade regimes.
Right.
In fact, the African countries, many of them have opened up. They've liberalized their policies fairly much over the last 20 years. What tends to be missing are some of the other conditions like infrastructure, assurance of security.
Right. I'd love to get your comment on that, John. I'm very struck by Alan's statement that addressing corruption, I think it's really saying, in these countries is also a very important ingredient.
Yes, of course it is. And as Alan rightly pointed out, that if you know that whatever you earn, whatever pittance it is, gets siphoned off by corrupt officials, you will either hide what you produce or you won't work very hard. But ascribing all of the ills of Africa or any other country to corruption are finding a single cause of a very complex situation. It's not very accurate. Not mean I'm in favor of corruption, by the way. I mean, if you take Africa as an example, Africa's future will lie in expanding its production and selling it. Some of those sales will be in the markets of the rich countries. It already is. Right. If you walk into handicraft stores in the United States, you'll see lots of things produced in Africa. But a lot of it, in African terms, will be trade between countries within Africa, because everyone treats Africa as a single entity. Of course, as you well know, it's 54 different countries with totally different geographies and endowments of talent. Now, you start out with the proposition that most African farmers are very, very effective farmers because they grow things in very, very tough environments with very little support from the outside. No agricultural extension, no investment, no easy access to credit, and so on and so forth. But the problem, as Alan said, is you can't get what you produce out. And the need for transportation infrastructure in Africa is very great. Similarly, most poor people are not in very good health because they don't have any money to pay for health care or to get an adequate diet. So better health and some degree of education is equally important. These are the basic factors of poverty, dealing with poverty.
Let me build on those things, because I think you've both pointed out, Alan first, and in the sense of how economics can be a very important tool, trade in particular, to help these countries and these individuals out of their situation. But infrastructure is a word that's cropped up in both of your answers, and that suggests to me, John, from the aid side of this, what does that tell us? I mean, that we have to develop a different sort of philosophy, perhaps, about aid targeted at the infrastructure that supports the kinds of things that trade could do in these places. I think we have to think about this aid in support of trade differently, perhaps.
Yes, I think, and you're quite right. And the world is now engaged in that in the context of the current trade negotiations about thinking how to increase the effectiveness of aid for trade. And it's going to have to involve infrastructure, but a lot of other things. But there's one important issue in all of this, that aid from the outside for any purpose, but particularly to increase capacity to trade, will not work unless governments and countries are committed to doing something about it. I mean, if you continue to be ruled by elites that want to just put money in their pockets, as Alan so rightly put, who are not willing to take the tough steps to invest in people and in assets, and to, even if they don't redistribute all of the gains from trade, distribute some of them, the impact of trade or aid will be diminished. So there's a tough bargain that has to be driven between those who provide aid and those who use it to make sure it's used in the most effective fashion.
And is there a sense that we have to bring those recipient countries even more strongly into the process of how the aid policies are set? I mean, make them more at the table, so to speak?
You know, the world's been at the aid business, if you want to put it that way, for 40 or 50 years. A great deal has been learned. And one of the things that, one of the prime lessons is that unless countries are committed to making, leaders are, and people are committed to making the changes necessary, aid will not be very effective. Once it is, and once they are willing to do so, aid can be very, very effective, as it has been in many countries around the world.
The questions that we're talking about, gentlemen, are, of course, are on the table as we speak, I think, in this Doha round. Is that correct? Which is something I really want our viewers to get informed on, and with both your help and you in particular, Alan. And as I understand it, this is a critical month, this month of April, and April 30th in particular is the deadline for the Doha discussions on liberalizing trade. I guess my first curiosity, Alan, would be what you might call the mood of the moment. Do you have a sense that there is a productive discussion underway between both camps, so to say, developed nations and the underdeveloped community of nations, about alleviating poverty through trade?
That's a very complex question. Trade negotiations are always a game of posturing and position taking, and so one is more or less staggers from crisis to crisis, and April the 30th will just be the next one that we happen to have. We had one at the end of last year and 2 years before that. So I think one at the moment, the commentary that one hears is not really very encouraging at all.
Right, that's what I
People are saying, the other side are just not serious about this. And there's, to be honest, as an outsider, there's plenty to be depressed about. However, we are always depressed at these sorts of points, and the question in a sense is whether anything is going on behind the scenes or whether there's little bits of movement that may come along at the 11th hour. I think there's still a reasonable chance that we will be able to close the round with some achievements. It won't be the greatest, we won't make the greatest progress that we can imagine, but I think we will probably achieve something. I think one of the things we have to remember is that, again, it's not developed versus developing and just a focus on poverty. The World Trade Organization, which is the organization of which the Doha Round is part, is designed and is there essentially to liberalize trade, full stop.
Right.
And so quite a lot of other interests, perfectly legitimate interests, making money for richer people as well, creating jobs, factories and so on, are also there. So poverty is only part of the story. We called this round a development round 4 or 5 years ago, essentially as a rhetorical device. No one quite knew what a development round would be. And now, in a sense, it's come back to haunt us because there's a lot of useful stuff that can be done other than the purely poverty dimension. And in some sense, the intractability of much of the poverty dimension is giving the round a bit of a bad name.
Yeah.
I think we'll find on April the 30th that we haven't achieved what we said we hoped we would achieve, but there'll be a girding of loins and we'll say, no, we'll get there by the middle of June. The absolute drop-dead date is really the middle of next year when the United States negotiating authority runs out. After that point, any deal that was struck essentially could be unpicked by the Congress, so nobody will sign anything.
What you're referring to is the fast-track authority the president has up until that point.
Exactly right. And the fast track says to Congress, you vote for or against. You can't unpick it. And clearly you can't have a negotiation going on for years where one side reserves the right to take the bits they like and rule out the bits they don't like after the deal's been closed.
Well, Alan, I appreciate that answer. It's both well-informed and extremely candid. I have been reading the commentary, though, in developing world newspapers, and for example, they contrast the expectations for this round against those for the Uruguay round, where they felt the tables and the dice were essentially loaded against them. So their expectations are extremely high. Do you think their regrets or resentments might be just as high if this doesn't produce the... Because you say this is more about more than poverty, that's true, but their concern is precisely the poverty issue.
Their concern is poverty, but again, one must remember there are plenty of interests in the developing countries that aren't representing the interests of their poorest citizens. When John talks about $1 or $2 a day, exactly as we said, then these people aren't well placed to take advantage of opportunities. Neither are they well placed to influence their government's positions in the round. Very often the interests that come forward and make it through to the negotiating table in an international forum actually are somewhat elitist interests. Now that's not to be cynical or denigrate the interests of developing country governments. I think they are making a genuine effort. But again, we shouldn't equate everything that they say, in a sense, with a very direct attack on poverty.
I think you're counseling all of us to have a more sophisticated view of this process, to realize it's very complex and the different factors can influence things positively, even if they're not directed at poverty as a
I certainly do
goal.
believe that a large part of what the answer, a large part of the answer to poverty is creating a generally healthy economic environment, and that includes benefits that are reaped by the non-poor, who then make opportunities for the poor. One has to be conscious about bringing the poor in through issues of training, of health, and ensuring that they have access to markets. But the general process, it seems to me, is a very important part of it. I think there will be great disappointment if this round fails completely. And to be honest, that's why I don't think it will fail completely. In the end, no one wants to have the responsibility for crashing the round, and everybody can see there's something to be gained.
Right.
But we haven't, I think, perhaps talked long enough, analysed cleverly enough, or maybe just waited long enough to achieve all that could be achieved through a really constructive trade agreement for addressing poverty.
And let me pick up on that point with you, John Sewell. What could be achieved? I mean, I guess what I'm struggling for now as we come close to the conclusion of our conversation is a sense of realism about what could work. And I think Alan's comments have been to remind us we have to be very pragmatic about all of this.
And let me answer your question in two ways. The important point to remember is the WTO negotiations are between sovereign states, and they're each trying to get the best deal, and that's quite legitimate. Mm-hmm. And that's what their negotiators are paid for. But there's a bigger U.S. interest in this, which is a systemic interest, that a well-working international trade system, just like a well-working development system, is very, very important for the United States. Now, the people who, in this country, who set up the post-World War II international system realized that. That's why they founded the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund and the GATT, the trade organization. We're at that stage now where we won't get what we want out of the Doha round unless we accommodate to the needs of very important developing countries, India and China, of course, clearly, but lots of other countries, because they won't sign on to the agreement. And unless they sign on to the agreement, there's no agreement. There's a very complex process going on that receives much too little attention in this country, of political bargaining among countries who are going to all want to end up agreeing, but there's going to have to be enough in the package for everybody to get that agreement, which, as I said, is very much in the American interest as well as the other countries.
John, that strikes me as wisdom, as both of you gentlemen have expressed today. I think of the workings of a fine watch that has to be designed to balance everyone's interest, and we're essentially in a new age, a new economy, a new world, and everyone's got to get something positive out of this for it to work correctly. Gentlemen, thank you so much for being with me on Dialogue.
Thank you. Our pleasure.
And that's our program. We appreciate your comments, and you can reach us at dialogue@wilsoncenter.org. I'm George Liston, CA, and you've been watching Dialogue, a co-production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and MHC Networks. Dialogue is also on the MHZ Worldview channel, which is available to public TV stations nationwide. For more information, go to www.mhzworldview.org. And please join us again right here next week. And thank you for watching. And thank you, gentlemen, very, very much.